I saw my wife leaving with another man before the company party ended, so I ran after them, my heart racing more from desperation than from the footsteps. When I caught up with them in the parking lot, the way she held his hand said it all. I turned and walked away without a word, ending our story there. In the following days, she tried to justify herself, but her lover made it clear he never wanted anything serious. Alone and remorseful, she faced her own mistake. I gradually rebuilt my life and found a new love, someone who offered me respect, presence, and the calm I deserved. Some time later, she came to me with downcast eyes, apologizing. I forgave her. Not to get back together, but to free us both from the burden of our hurt. And that was when she understood the weight of the choice she had made. And even though her words still echo in my head sometimes, even though the scent of her perfume still lingers in some of my closet's memories, it wasn't in that parking lot that the pain began. The pain had already been building in silences, in averted glances, in messages she always typed too quickly. But in that parking lot, under the cold, yellow light of a crooked streetlight, she confirmed what I'd already suspected but never had the courage to accept. I wasn't enough anymore. Or worse, I never was. And the worst part wasn't what I saw, but what she didn't do. He didn't let go of her hand, didn't chase after me, didn't say a word. He let me go. As if it were just the natural closure of something that had been dead for a long time, and maybe it was. Love, you know, doesn't die suddenly. It dries up slowly, until nothing remains but the bitter taste of indifference. She tried to explain herself later. She fired off messages at random times, like someone throwing bottles into the ocean hoping one will be found. She waited for me outside my house, left notes in the car, sent me crying audio messages, saying it was all a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing, that he meant nothing. But the truth is, we always know what we're doing when we decide to cheat. We only choose to forget it after it goes wrong. And it went wrong for her. Because he, the lover, didn't stay. He never intended to stay. He said to her face, without guilt, without drama, like someone ending a work call, "You knew from the start this wasn't serious." And so, she, who once held my hand so proudly in front of everyone, was left alone, with her eyes swollen and her pride in tatters. While she desperately tried to pick up the pieces of a castle she herself set on fire, I did the opposite. I began to rebuild. I reconnected with my own silences, learned to sleep on the left side of the bed without waiting for a body on the other side. I began to drink coffee in silence, without music, without rushing, just feeling the taste of absence transforming into peace. Little by little, I began to smile again. To look people in the eye. To walk with my head held high. And it was on one of those ordinary days, without any expectations, that I met someone. Someone who listened to me attentively. Who didn't need exaggerated explanations to understand my pauses. Who respected my time. And, above all, who didn't confuse love with convenience. He didn't heal me, nobody heals anyone, but he walked with me as I learned to heal myself. Time passed, as it always does. And then, on one of those days when the past decides to knock on the door, she returned. Not arrogantly. Nor with exaggerated tears. But with her eyes downcast, as if she had finally understood the depth of her fall. She said she was sorry. That she had been afraid of growing old without living. That she had confused desire with love, adventure with freedom. And that, in the end, all that remained was an echo of what she had destroyed. I heard it all. Calmly. There was no more anger, no more pain. Just an empty space where a story once lived. And I told her I forgave her. Not for her. But for myself. Because carrying resentment was keeping alive a pain that no longer deserved my time. And in that moment, looking into her eyes, I saw that she understood. Not because of forgiveness, but because of the impossibility of going back. And it was only after everything, when I no longer expected any explanation, that I received the letter. An old letter, written during our marriage, which she had kept among her memories. The handwriting was mine. The words were mine. But the love, that love was gone. It was a letter in which I said I wanted to grow old with her. That no matter what happened, I would always be there. That she was my home. My person. And she returned it to me not as a plea for her back, but as a belated confession. Like someone delivering a body for burial. And there, amid those dead words, she realized what she had done. She killed something most people spend their entire lives searching for. With a choice. A moment. A touch of a hand in the parking lot. You can't imagine how painful it is to read a promise you wrote yourself, knowing it was destroyed by the very person who was supposed to protect it. To know that the future you swore to build was cancelled without warning. And the cruelest thing is knowing it could still exist, if love had been enough. But it wasn't. And when regret arrived, it was too late. There was already another woman by my side. Another love. A pure, light, silent love. A love born not of euphoria, but of truth. And she knew it. When she saw me with someone else and couldn't recognize who I was. When she realized I had become everything she despised, and now desired back. But time, that old, implacable judge, had already passed its sentence. She lost more than a husband. She lost the version of herself that existed by my side. She lost the knowing laughter, the lazy Sundays, the proud looks at family dinners. She lost the pure love, the kind that doesn't demand, doesn't measure, doesn't negotiate. And all of this for what? For a moment. For a distraction. For a tight hand in the parking lot, while I turned my back and left in silence, taking with me the end of our story. And it was this silence that echoed louder than any scream. Because sometimes, the greatest answer is to say nothing. It's to let the void speak. And hers screamed so loudly that she could never hear herself again. But there's one thing she never knew. A secret I've kept all this time. Something that, if she'd discovered it sooner, maybe she would have done everything differently. Maybe I would have hesitated. Maybe she would have chosen to love me again, just for fear of losing something that can't be recovered. And it's this secret that changes everything. Because not every betrayal destroys only the present. Some destroy entire futures. And sometimes, even destinies. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All stories are fiction, but inspired by the reality of those who have suffered, fallen, and risen again. Our objective is clear: show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and leaves deep scars, which often never heal. Get ready now to hear a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Because whoever betrays always pay the price. His name was Daniel. He was the kind of man who went unnoticed by those who only saw the surface shine, but impossible to forget by those who saw beyond. He wasn't the most handsome man in the room, nor the most outgoing. But there was something in his gaze, a calm weight, a kind of silent presence that comforted. His gestures were simple, but carried a rare care. He was the kind of person who noticed what no one else noticed: a cup half out of place, the hidden weariness on someone's face, a tear held back during a casual conversation. He had grown up in a modest but loving home. He knew from an early age the value of loyalty, of a given word, of the silent effort one makes for another even when no one is looking. He never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He never liked games, half-truths, or lukewarm love. He believed that true love was the kind that endured boredom, silence, and seasons. The kind that stayed, even when everything seemed to fade away. Her name, on the other hand, was Laura. And Laura always had a natural glow, a light way of filling spaces. She was communicative, had an easy laugh, and a way of touching someone's arm while speaking that made anyone feel special. She carried an aura of independence, as if she owned her own world, but behind her smiles lay a restless soul. Laura had always been afraid of time. I dreaded the idea of stagnation, as if stopping were the same as disappearing. I sought intensity in everything, in the books I read, the friendships I maintained, the trips I dreamed of taking. When she met Daniel, she felt different. He wasn't like other men who tried to impress her with exaggerated promises or pretty words. Daniel simply looked at her as if he already knew her. As if he knew that, behind the expansive energy, there was a woman tired of being misunderstood. And she, for the first time in a long time, felt safe. With him, I didn't have to act. I could just be her. And it was this simplicity that enchanted her. Their beginnings were light, as should be the beginnings of any love that has the chance to grow deeply. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Daniel liked to listen, and Laura liked to be listened to. He made her laugh with discreet observations, and she drove him crazy with her light-hearted, humorous teasing. They found in each other the balance between peace and movement. He offered ground. She, wings. They decided to move in together after 2 years of dating. The choice wasn't impulsive, but out of a mature sense of belonging. They felt that a house, when shared by two people who respect each other, becomes a true home. They bought a small apartment, but full of windows. It was like them, not luxurious, but full of light. Daniel tended the plants on the balcony while Laura chose the paintings for the walls. Little by little, they filled that space with smells, music, and routines that naturally intertwined. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were days of silence, tiredness, and misunderstandings. But there were also peaceful reconciliations, lingering hugs, and the certainty that they were building something solid. Between simple dinners and lazy Sundays, their life together gained substance. Daniel continued to be the man who left notes on the mirror with small, sweet messages. Laura, in turn, still surprised him with new recipes and spontaneous ideas. They kept their curiosity alive, even after years together. The wedding came almost as a natural outcome. There was no extravagant proposal. Just a sincere conversation during a weekend trip, where they realized their love had matured. They married in a low-key ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family. Everyone said they made an inspiring couple. There was something in the way they looked at each other, somewhere between respect and admiration. Laura, in a light dress and loose hair, seemed to have finally found a place where she could rest. Daniel, with the tranquility of someone who knows exactly where he wants to be, couldn't stop smiling. They promised each other fidelity, but more than that, they promised honesty, even on difficult days, even when their love was tested. The post-wedding routine brought new discoveries. Laura began to dedicate herself more intensely to work, immersing herself in projects that required time, attention, and energy. Daniel, on the other hand, kept his life simpler. He worked in design and opted for more flexible hours to keep his home life organized and relaxed. The dynamic between them changed subtly. Conversations became more spaced out. Spontaneous get-togethers gave way to scheduled times. But there was still love. There was still affection. Daniel didn't complain. He understood Laura's ambitions. He admired her strength. Laura also saw him as a haven. But little by little, the gestures became automatic. The kisses, brief. The hugs, mechanical. And no one seemed to notice how far they were drifting apart. Or maybe they did, but preferred not to say it out loud. After all, love is also about resisting wear and tear, isn't it? Trips became rarer. Dinners became quieter. The TV began to fill the spaces that had previously been reserved for conversation. Daniel missed the initial lightness, but he never stopped trying. He planned small moments, suggested outings, wrote notes. Laura smiled, thanked him, but she was always tired. Always distracted. There was a heaviness in her gaze that he couldn't decipher. Sometimes he watched her sleep and wondered if she was still the same woman he'd fallen in love with. Other times, he wondered if he himself was still the man capable of making her happy. But these thoughts came and went, like passing clouds. There were no fights. There were no scandals. Just a slowness, a lukewarm indifference that slowly crept in, without anyone realizing how dangerous it was. Among colleagues and acquaintances, the couple was still seen as an example. They posted smiling photos, joked at family gatherings, and said they were fine. And they were. At least on the surface. Because the truth is, not all love dies with shouting. Sometimes it fades in silence. In small oversights. In promises that are postponed. In conversations that never happen. Laura immersed herself more and more in commitments. She began going out frequently, claiming company events, client meetings, and late afternoon get-togethers. Daniel, always understanding, didn't question her. Not because he didn't have doubts, but because he trusted. And perhaps that was her greatest virtue, or her greatest mistake. Trusting too much in someone who no longer knew what to do with that trust. On weekends, Laura always seemed exhausted. She slept late, answering text messages with a serious expression, as if she were somewhere else. Daniel made coffee, left it on the table, and waited for a conversation that almost never came. He began writing in a notebook. Not as a way to vent, but as an attempt to understand what was happening. He wrote about the small changes, about the longing he felt even though he was by her side. He wrote about love, about time, about the fear of loving alone. But he never confronted Laura. Partly out of respect. Partly out of fear of the response. And so, the days passed. The seasons changed. Love, which once seemed unshakable, was now like a piece of cracked porcelain, still whole, but about to shatter. Daniel still believed. Perhaps because, for him, that was what love was, persisting even when the other person no longer seemed the same. And Laura, even though distant, carried an ambiguous look. Sometimes she seemed lost. Other times, simply absent. As if she wanted to return but no longer knew the way. As if she were waiting for something that even she couldn't define. And perhaps that was exactly it. Perhaps life, with its routines, had suffocated something that needed air. Perhaps their love had fallen victim to its own silence. But in that house, between open windows and increasingly rare smiles, there was still a silent hope. A last attempt to keep alive what so many had let die. They still looked at each other. They still slept in the same bed. They still laughed, sometimes. But something was different. Something invisible, but present. And their story, which until then had been about love, began to move toward a point where their decisions would leave deep scars. Because love, when left untended, doesn't disappear. It gets sick. And when it gets sick, it starts to hurt. And it was like that, amid silences and practiced smiles, that their story began to change. Without either of them saying it out loud. Without anyone around them noticing. But something had already begun to be lost. And no one, yet, knew how much that would cost. Laura began spending more time away from home. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but the absences accumulated like dust on forgotten furniture. First came the meetings that ended late, then the short trips that came at the last minute, accompanied by hurried explanations. Daniel, as always, listened silently, believing every word, still trying to justify the changes to himself as part of the natural rhythm of life. He didn't question, not out of naivete, but out of faith. Faith in the woman he chose to love. Faith in the home they had built together with such care. He believed that difficult times were meant to teach, that distance was temporary, that love, true love, endured. But the nights became long. Sundays, empty. Conversations, almost automatic. Daniel saw Laura as if she were there and, at the same time, far away. She still laughed at some jokes, still sat next to him on the couch, still rested her head on his shoulder during movies. But there was a new weight in her gestures. A hesitation in his eyes. And it was this emptiness disguised as presence that hurt the most. Laura was no longer in the same place emotionally. Something inside her had shifted. The intensity she had always sought, that had always defined her, now seemed to come from another source. But she tried to keep it all under control. She tried to keep the marriage running smoothly, tried to leave no trace of what she was experiencing away from there. There was guilt in her actions, but there was also denial. She told herself it was just a phase, that it meant nothing, that she was confused, tired, lost between the woman she was and the woman she had become. Sometimes, when she came home, she would find Daniel preparing something simple for dinner, with soft music in the background and the gentle scent of the incense he liked. And in those moments, a part of her wavered. A part wanted to go back. But the other was no longer entirely his. As the weeks passed, Daniel began to notice details that hadn't been there before. Different clothes, new perfumes, hastily answered messages. Her phone, previously left carelessly on the table, was now always face down or on silent. He noticed the small glances she'd taken, the unexplained delays, the lapses in memory. Once, as she was getting ready for yet another of those corporate events, he watched her silently from the doorway. She was beautiful, as always. But there was something in her eyes, something like an irreversible distance. He smiled, trying to disguise the pain that was rising like a lump in his throat. He asked if she'd be back late. She replied, probably, without looking directly at him. And then she left, leaving a new scent in the air and a feeling he couldn't name, but which tightened his chest as if announcing the end of something. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Anxiety, that unnamed restlessness, made him get up several times to drink water, open windows, look at the street as if hoping to find some answer in the silence of the early morning. He felt he was about to discover something he didn't want to know. But like any man in love, he preferred doubt to certainty. Because certainty has weight. It has form. It has consequences. Over the next few days, he tried to return to his routine, focus on work, tend to the plants, keep the house alive. But everything seemed lifeless without her. And the cruelest thing was that she was there. And, at the same time, she wasn't. Her absence was physical, even in her presence. And this absence was becoming unbearable. One afternoon, folding a pile of clothes in his room, Daniel found something that made him freeze. It was a movie ticket, from a date and time when she had said she was in a meeting. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a gap. A crack in the narrative. The first puncture in a balloon about to burst. He put the paper away without saying anything. Not because he wanted to pretend he hadn't seen it, but because he needed more. He needed to understand. He needed to know exactly where he had lost the woman he loved. He began to observe more closely. To listen between the lines. Smelling the lie before it was even spoken. And deep down, he still wanted to be wrong. He still hoped it was all a figment of his imagination, worn down by time and the longing for a love that, perhaps, only he still felt. Then the invitation to Laura's company party arrived. An annual, formal event, one she always mentioned with a certain pride. Daniel wasn't particularly fond of such settings, but he decided to go. He felt he needed to be close, see for himself, touch that reality that seemed so distant to him. Laura hesitated, but agreed with a practiced smile. On the night of the event, she looked impeccable. She wore a dress he'd never seen before. When he asked if it was new, she changed the subject. They arrived together, but it was as if they'd arrived in different cars. In the ballroom, she was immediately overwhelmed by colleagues, by greetings, by conversations that didn't include Daniel. He stood on the sidelines, like a last-minute guest. He watched her every move with an attention that mixed love and pain. He saw how she lit up at certain moments, how she smiled differently at certain people. He tried to ignore it. He tried to enjoy the evening. But something was wrong. Something that grew inside him like a fever. It was almost by chance that he saw her leave through the side door, discreetly, looking around before disappearing. Something inside Daniel screamed. Instinct, wounded love, desperation. He followed her, his heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in the empty hallways. When he reached the parking lot, he paused for a second, as if needing courage to continue. And then he saw it. In the dim light of the streetlights, Laura was with her back to him, leaning against another man's car. She was laughing at something he was saying, her gaze filled with intimacy. And then, as if in a natural gesture, without hesitation, she took his hand. There were no words. There was no scandal. There was only that touch. And in that touch was everything. All the confirmation Daniel needed. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't make a scene. He simply turned and walked away. Each step was a rupture. Each step was a renunciation. He arrived home with the silence clinging to his skin. He walked in, took off his shoes, lay down on the empty bed, and stared at the ceiling. What to do with a love that didn't die, but was betrayed? What to do with the image of the woman he swore to love holding another man's hand? What to do with all the years, the plans, the dreams? That night, he didn't sleep. And perhaps I never slept the same way again after that. Because there are truths that, once discovered, change everything. That tear from within us a part that never returns. And it was in that silence, between suppressed tears and painful memories, that Daniel understood. He understood that sometimes love doesn't end for lack of feeling, but for too much pain. In the days that followed, Laura tried to justify herself. She said she was confused, that things had gotten mixed up, that she didn't want to hurt anyone. But words no longer held any power. Daniel didn't want explanations. He didn't want shouting, or promises. He just wanted distance. He wanted silence. And that's what he did. He walked away. He began to rebuild his life with the pieces that remained. And even though he was hurt, even though he was devastated inside, he walked. Slowly, but he walked. But there was something Laura didn't know yet. Something that wasn't in the words exchanged, nor in the tears she would shed later. A detail that would change everything. A secret Daniel had kept, unaware of the impact it would have. And that secret was yet to be revealed. Laura didn't seek Daniel out in the following days with the same intensity as before. She seemed to finally understand that words would be useless in the face of what he had witnessed. She knew there was no longer room for improvised excuses or flimsy arguments. He had seen it with his own eyes. And he had left. But like every true feeling that is hurt, the pain doesn't fade with time alone. It transforms. And with Daniel, it transformed into a heavy silence, one that didn't scream, but suffocated. He continued trying to reorganize his existence, but there were moments when the image of Laura holding another man's hand would resurface like a ghost in the most banal details of the day, an empty pillow, a forgotten toothbrush, a vague scent of shampoo on the towel. He no longer cried, but he also didn't truly smile. It was as if an essential part of him had been removed without anesthesia. Just a void where a complete love once resided. One day, while opening one of the drawers in the cabinet in his office, Daniel found a small, antique box made of dark wood. He himself had given the box to Laura early in their marriage, telling her she could store anything too important to leave exposed there. Curious, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite name, he opened it. Inside were old letters, movie tickets, Polaroid photos of them on trips that seemed to have happened in another life. But at the bottom of the trunk was a loose envelope, in Laura's handwriting, written simply, "I never had the courage." Daniel hesitated. It no longer belonged to him. But something in that sentence seemed to beg to be read. He removed the paper and unfolded it carefully. The letter was long. Written hurriedly, but with clear emotion. It was a confession. Not of betrayal, he already knew that. But of something even more devastating. In the text, Laura recounted an old letter Daniel had written to her years ago, in the middle of an ordinary night, in which he said he wanted to grow old with her, saying that even if life separated them, he would continue to choose her, every day, even on the worst days. She said she had kept that letter for a long time, like a charm, as proof that she was loved in a rare way. But in a moment of silent rage, feeling neglected, unable to express her own fears and frustrations, she tore it up. Alone, in her room. For no real reason. Simply because she thought that by destroying the paper, she would silence her feelings. And there, tearing up the purest proof of love she had ever received, she realized she had broken something that would never be the same again. Daniel read each line as if reading the diagnosis of an irreversible loss. It wasn't the paper that mattered, but what it represented. It was the symbol of everything he had built and she, on impulse, destroyed. Not with another man. But with a thoughtless gesture, silently, without his knowledge. And then, she wrote something else. He said that, months after he tore up the letter, he tried to rewrite it from memory. He sat for hours, trying to remember the words, the phrases, the details. But everything had been erased. What she destroyed could not be recreated. And that this haunted her every day, even when she smiled, even when she pretended to be fine. He said he had kept this secret because he was ashamed, because he knew it didn't make sense rationally, but that, emotionally, it was the beginning of the end. And that, in a way, there, in that moment, when he tore up that paper, he had also begun to destroy the love he had received. Daniel closed his eyes. The pain of the physical betrayal was still there, raw, lingering. But this revelation touched a deeper chord. Because the torn letter wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the reminder that he had believed in something eternal. And what it had destroyed was exactly that, the promised eternity. When she arrived home that night, she found Daniel sitting on the couch, the box beside him. There was no anger on his face. No tears. Just weariness. When she asked if he had read it, he simply nodded. And then the silence stretched, as if they both knew they were on the verge of something definitive. Laura tried to explain. She said she was fragile, that she missed being heard, that she couldn't communicate with him. Daniel listened in silence. Until, finally, he spoke. Not shouting. But with that calm that has always defined him. He said what hurt most wasn't the fact that she had cheated on him. But that she had single-handedly destroyed the one thing he could never rebuild. He said that the letter was written on a night when he felt lost, doubting himself, and that writing to her was his way of finding meaning. And that now, knowing it had been torn up, hidden, and silenced would tear him to pieces. Laura stood up, approached him, tried to touch him. But Daniel backed away. He said their love was made of choices. And that she had made all the choices that drove him apart. That she could have said it, could have shown it, could have cried. But she chose to destroy it in silence. And that now, he no longer knew how to love someone who had single-handedly broken everything they were. She cried, asked for forgiveness, spoke of regret. But what echoed there wasn't an apology. It was the sound of something already too broken to be put back together. In the following days, Daniel left the house. Not in fury. But with the dignity of someone who knew he had loved until the end. He took few things with him. He left behind mementos, furniture, paintings. He took only the lightness of no longer carrying guilt that wasn't his. Laura remained, surrounded by memories that now suffocated her. He tried to rebuild something, but the emptiness was unbearable. In every corner of the house, a reminder of what he had lost. And deep down, he knew it wasn't because of the betrayal that everything had ended. It was because of the letter. Because it was there, in that gesture, that she had shattered the foundation of his love for her. The betrayal was merely the consequence of a series of choices she had made. And then, one day, walking down the street, Daniel saw something he hadn't expected. In a small bookstore, he saw a display case of old love letters, sold as collector's items. And there, standing in front of the window, he understood everything. What is written doesn't always survive. But what is felt, that never completely disappears. The memory of that night, of the handwritten letter, of the sincere promises, was still with him. Not as pain. But as a testament to someone who loves completely. And perhaps, one day, he would write again. But this time, for someone who knew how to cherish them. Daniel moved into a modest apartment on a quiet street, surrounded by trees that swayed in the wind as if trying to soothe everything he still carried inside. The new house was small, but it offered him a different silence than the one he'd experienced in recent months, a clean silence, with no tension in the corners, no unspoken words echoing off the walls. He began decorating the space with objects that symbolized a new beginning. The plants returned. The soft music that once filled the house now played softly on the record player, as if it were the soundtrack to a life slowly reshaping itself. He no longer spoke about the past. Not because he'd forgotten it, but because he understood that brooding only delays healing. Even so, there were days when the world seemed to stop for entire seconds, like when he passed a cafe where he used to meet Laura after work or bumped into someone who was part of their circle. In those moments, time seemed to breathe more strongly, reminding him that certain pains don't tell you when they'll pass. Laura, on the other hand, remained in her old apartment. Now, the room seemed larger, but not because of space. It was his absence that made everything feel bigger. The closet still held a few items Daniel had forgotten, and every time she opened one of the doors, it was like opening new wounds in barely formed scars. For a few weeks, she tried to fill the empty spaces with movement. She rearranged the furniture, changed curtains, donated clothes. But no physical gesture could change the emotional space he had left. Her friends, once so present, seemed more distant now. Many learned of the betrayal. Some went silent, others drifted away. She discovered, the hard way possible, that when you lose someone like Daniel, you don't just lose a love. You also lose your self-image. And all she saw in the mirror was a version of herself she didn't recognize. She tried to write. She tried to work more. He tried to fill her days with routines. But there was no routine left to comfort her. Months passed. The seasons changed. And life, in its relentless flow, continued. Daniel reconnected with some old friends, rediscovered the pleasure of walking at night, aimlessly, just to feel his body moving. He avoided social media, avoided news about Laura, avoided returning to anything that reminded him of her. One day, however, during an art exhibition, he met someone. It wasn't immediate, nor intense. It was calm, light, almost imperceptible. Her name was Helena. A serene woman, with a gentle smile and a curious gaze. She had also gone through a painful breakup, and perhaps because of that, she expected nothing more than a good conversation. The two began seeing each other frequently, not out of need, but out of genuine affinity. With her, Daniel felt different. There was no weight, no past hanging in the air. There was a new freedom, a possibility of writing new letters, this time to a story that was being born clean. Laura found out about Helena by chance, running into a mutual friend at a coffee shop. When she heard the name and learned that Daniel was with another woman, her chest tightened in a way she hadn't expected. She no longer had the right to care, but she did. Not because she wanted him to be alone, but because she suddenly understood that he was truly moving on. That the memories they'd shared were being buried by new ones she'd never be a part of. He came home that afternoon and stared at the wooden box again. He read the letter he'd written and never sent. He considered throwing it away. He considered calling it. But he chose to do something he hadn't done in a long time, listen. He listened to his own feelings. He listened to the silence. And in that silence, he knew the love he'd lost could not be regained. But still, she felt something inside her need to be said, not by him, but by herself. A month later, Laura showed up at the place where Daniel taught occasional classes on design and creativity. It was an activity he had recently resumed. When he saw her there, at the back of the room, he felt a slight shiver, but not of anger. It was strangely neutral. She waited for him outside. He approached slowly, as calm as ever, but with the firmness of someone who had crossed bridges of no return. Laura simply ordered a coffee. They sat in silence for a few minutes until she began to speak. She said she hadn't expected anything, that she knew he was in a different phase, but that there was something she needed to say, looking him in the eye. He told her he'd kept that letter for months. That he'd torn up the original in a moment of silent fury, and that ever since, he felt he'd killed with his own hands the last pure memory of what they'd had. He said he tried to rewrite it, but he'd never managed to capture its essence. That everything I tried to put on paper seemed smaller than the real feeling. Daniel listened to her. With attention. With respect. But with a detachment she'd never seen in him. Not because he was being cruel, but because he was different now. Grief had shaped him. Absence had reshaped him. He was no longer the same man she'd left in that parking lot months before. When she finished speaking, there was a long silence. And then he responded. He said the letter wasn't missed because he still remembered every word she'd written that morning. That those words were, for him, a promise made with his soul. And that even torn, they were still alive. Not for her. But for him. Because those who truly write, write forever. But the love that inspired that letter had died. Not just because of the betrayal. But because she'd torn something that should have been kept with the same reverence with which it was written. Laura held back tears. Not out of pride. But because she knew that moment wasn't about forgiveness. It was about acceptance. He continued, saying he now understood something he'd missed before, that not everyone knows what to do with a complete love. That often, people ask for intensity, but when they receive depth, they're frightened. That she sought the extraordinary in fragile places, and lost the essential by not recognizing it when she held it in her hands. She lowered her eyes and apologized one last time, but he just smiled. Not a smile of irony. But of liberation. He said he forgave her. Not to ease her pain, but to finally release the pain she'd carried for so long. And in that moment, she understood. She understood that forgiveness was the last thing that still connected them. And that now, there was nothing left. They said goodbye without hugs. Without promises. Just a long look, as if sealing a chapter that would never be reopened. Daniel returned to the life he was building with Helena. He continued his classes, his walks, his new letters. And Laura, for the first time in a long time, began to look herself in the mirror. She knew nothing would ever be the same again. That Daniel was now history. But in that past, there was a lesson she would never forget: when you tear up a proof of love, you don't just destroy paper. You destroy trust, time, and the future that could have been. She wouldn't get another chance. But now, at least, she had a conscience. And somewhere far away, in a windowless apartment, Daniel put on a record, with Helena dancing barefoot around the living room. And as he observed that simple, sincere moment, he realized he was exactly where he belonged. Not because he'd forgotten what he'd experienced. But because he'd learned to love again, and better. The days following Daniel and Laura's last encounter carried the weight of finality, not because there was anger or unresolved pain, but because everything had finally found its place. Time, once a silent enemy eroding the edges of what remained of their love, now became an ally in the healing process. Laura, leaving that cafe without looking back, felt for the first time that the words had been spoken, that there were no more excuses to offer, no more barely concealed hopes. Only life remained, with all its consequences, demanding of her a maturity she had long avoided. Upon returning home, she looked at her surroundings with different eyes. For the first time, she didn't cling to objects, to smells, or to nostalgia. She simply sat on the floor of the empty living room and took a deep breath, accepting that she was finally alone with herself. Daniel, for his part, resumed his routine with serenity. Not coldly, but lightly. There was a new clarity in his gestures, as if the pain had cleared his vision of what truly matters. Helena, perceptive as she was, noticed the changes but didn't question them. She understood that one's past doesn't have to be a ghost, but rather a journey that teaches one how to better navigate the present. Daniel and she continued building something unhurriedly, respecting each other's boundaries, offering affection daily, with simple gestures that didn't require grand promises to be meaningful. He had found in Helena not a replacement for lost love, but a new possibility of loving with the same dedication, now more conscious, more honest. With her, Sundays didn't need to be filled with euphoria, and silences didn't require explanations. They simply coexisted, with a kind of peace Daniel had never experienced before. Meanwhile, Laura faced a more solitary process of rebuilding. She began attending a support group for people who had faced traumatic breakups. She didn't talk about the betrayal in detail, but gradually, amidst accounts of other pain, she began to understand that her story wasn't unique. And precisely because it wasn't unique, it was real. Accepting this was harder than she expected. She always believed she was special, that her love with Daniel was different, almost shielded from the banality of common breakups. But deep down, she had neglected the essential, care. In the group, she heard a woman talk about how betrayal doesn't begin when someone sleeps with someone else, but when they emotionally abandon the person by their side. These words echoed in her mind like a truth she had avoided facing for a long time. Laura had betrayed long before the physical betrayal. She betrayed when she stopped listening, when she prioritized distractions over dialogue, when she harbored a grudge and transformed it into distance rather than vulnerability. One night, she decided to reread an old diary, where she'd written at the beginning of her relationship with Daniel. The words were full of enthusiasm, hope, and admiration. There were entries from ordinary days that, at the time, seemed special simply because they were together. With each page, she encountered a version of herself that now seemed distant. A version she truly loved, but which, over time, became impatient, demanding, and above all, ungrateful. She finished reading it, crying silently, not for the loss of Daniel, but for the loss of herself. She realized that the love he offered was more than she knew how to receive. And that the maturity he demonstrated, even in pain, was the kind of love that demands responsibility. Laura had confused freedom with escape, intensity with lack of control, novelty with substitution. And now, with all the time in the world alone, she understood that love is not about what the other offers us, but about what we do with it. Daniel, at the same time, began to be more sought after in his field. His calm demeanor, combined with his sensitivity, caught the attention of people seeking not only a professional but also someone who understood the human side of projects. He began to be invited to lectures, events, and creative gatherings. His voice, previously restrained and shy, now conveyed confidence and inspiration. The painful experience he had endured had not hardened him, on the contrary, it had made him even more empathetic. In one of these lectures, he spoke about emotional reconstruction. He didn't mention names or give details, but used his own wounds as a starting point to explain how affection is the true foundation of our choices. At the end, he received a standing ovation. Helena, who was in the audience, simply smiled, her eyes full of tenderness. She knew the man had been shattered, but she also knew he had managed to rebuild himself with rare dignity. One random late afternoon, while walking through a quiet park, Daniel saw a scene that froze him for a moment. A couple sat on a bench, laughing at something simple, their faces illuminated by the setting sun. For a second, his heart sank. Not with longing for what he'd experienced, but with a brief melancholy about everything that could have been and wasn't. But then, the image of Helena smiling came to mind. And with it, the certainty that not every loss is a tragedy. Some losses are deliverances. Others are lessons. And some, the rarest, are both. And there, sitting in the shade of a tree, he wrote on his phone's notepad a phrase he might never share with anyone, but which represented exactly where he was: to love is to insist when it's worth it, and to let go when there's nothing left to hold on to. Meanwhile, Laura decided to get away from the city for a while. She rented a small cabin in the mountains and began living silent days, where her only company was her own conscience. She carried books, wrote a lot, walked among the trees. She tried to understand who she was beyond the pain, beyond the guilt, beyond the image of the woman she herself had destroyed in the eyes of those who loved her. One morning, sitting on the porch with a hot cup in her hands, she wrote a letter. Not to Daniel, but to you. A letter of forgiveness, not justification. In it, he confessed all the small deaths he had caused within himself by straying from what was true. He promised that, from then on, he would never stop caring for what he loved, and that if love ever returned in any form, he would know how to protect it with the reverence he had failed to show before. He placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and placed it in a new wooden box. Not as a way of erasing the past, but to ensure that, this time, she would know how to cherish what mattered. On the other side, Daniel continued his life. Stronger, lighter, more whole. There were days when memories would surface, because forgetting isn't about erasing, it's about ceasing to hurt, but now those memories no longer hurt him. They simply existed, part of the journey. Helena loved him patiently, with presence, with truth. And he loved her back with the same dedication. They didn't need to promise forever. The now was enough. The past between him and Laura hadn't disappeared, but now it was just a story left in a previous chapter. A story with a necessary ending, but with a profound moral: love only survives when it is cared for. Neglected, it turns into absence. And every absence, when ignored, becomes distance. And too much distance, when it sets in, becomes an end. At that stage when everything seemed to have already been said, lived, and felt, fate, with its subtle irony, still had one last piece to move on the board. Daniel was going through a moment of complete inner reorganization. It was no longer about recovering from pain or proving anything to himself. Now, it was simply about living with integrity and surrendering all that remained of his story. His days with Helena took on new hues. There was comfort, there was complicity, but above all, there was reciprocity. The lightness he found in her was not an escape, it was the consequence of a love born without the weight of demands or unresolved absences. Helena admired him, not for what he'd been through, but for who he'd chosen to become after it all. And Daniel, in his own way, allowed her to access parts of him that had been locked away for too long. It was a slow, intimate, but real process. The invitation to speak at an international design conference arrived unexpectedly, and with it, an opportunity that until then seemed too distant to consider. The trip would require a few weeks abroad, which initially caused some hesitation. But Helena, upon hearing the proposal, simply smiled and said with the calm that only those who truly love can offer, "You have to go. It will be good for you. I'll be here when you get back." There was no pressure in her eyes, only sincere encouragement. Daniel accepted. It was more than an event, it was a silent sign that he was finally living for himself, for his own dreams, unmoved by fear, memories, or the need to prove something. Before leaving, he stopped by his sister's house to drop off some things and visit his nephews, and there, sitting at the table with hot coffee in his hands, he realized that the most important bonds were alive again around him. His family hadn't pressured him during the separation. They knew the pain, but they respected his time. Now they could laugh together again, share stories without the weight of the past interrupting the moments. Meanwhile, Laura was returning from her mountain season with a different kind of silence in her chest. A silence that didn't hurt, but still demanded answers. His seclusion had been less about escaping and more about relearning. He no longer wanted to try to erase what he'd done, but to deeply understand why he'd done it. Back in the city, she also returned to therapy, resumed some work as an independent consultant, and began getting involved in social projects supporting women facing emotional crises. It was her silent way of trying to balance what she'd caused. With each story she heard, she rediscovered pieces of herself and, with humility, accepted that the wounds we inflict on others are always mirrors of what we haven't yet resolved within ourselves. He was far from feeling at peace, but for the first time in a long time, he had a direction. It was during one of these volunteer activities, at a community school, that she encountered a familiar gaze. A young woman, through tears, confessed to the project psychologist that she had cheated on her boyfriend, that she felt lost, that she didn't know how to go back to being who she was before the choice she made. Laura didn't intervene at the time. But that night, at home, she wrote her an anonymous letter, saying, "Sometimes, when we cheat, we think the mistake is only in the action, but the root is in everything we neglected before that. Don't try to erase the guilt, understand where it comes from. Forgiveness begins when we forgive ourselves for who we've become. And decide to change." She sealed the letter, delivered it the next day without a name, and returned home with a restless heart. She knew that gesture didn't erase her past, but perhaps it was a small sign that she was finally understanding what needed to be understood. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Daniel presented to a diverse audience of people from different cultures and backgrounds. He spoke about design and creativity, but inevitably delved into deeper themes. He shared how creative processes often resemble our emotional processes: destruction, drafting, making mistakes, rebuilding, and creating a new version. At the end of the talk, he was approached by a Japanese man who, in heavily accented English, said, "Sometimes you have to break to reform more beautifully. You didn't break, you remade yourself." Daniel thanked him silently, with a small smile, and in that moment, he knew he was finally in the right place, doing what he was supposed to do. Upon returning, he found Helena waiting at the airport with a makeshift handwritten sign, "The world was better with you there, but it's more beautiful with you here." They laughed. They hugged. And in that embrace, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. It was no longer about an unresolved past, nor about the need to protect himself from new pain. It was, finally, about living in the present with courage and gratitude. The days that followed were peaceful, almost ordinary, and that was precisely what enchanted him most. There were no promises, but there was care. And that was enough. One afternoon, while visiting a new bookstore that had opened downtown, Daniel was leafing through a book of old letters when, among the pages, he found a delicately underlined quote, "The love lost through carelessness is always the hardest to forget." He took out his phone, took a photo, and sent it to Helena with a simple comment, "Thank goodness I know how to care now." She responded with a heart and an audio message saying, "And I know how to receive." Simple, direct. But it was all there. That same week, Laura was surprised by an invitation. An old colleague, now the director of a small publishing house, had read some of her writing published in an independent magazine and wanted to discuss the possibility of compiling her reflections into a book. The idea wasn't commercial, it was personal. She resisted at first, but after reflection, she accepted. Perhaps it was time to tell her story, not to justify what she'd experienced, but to transform what hurt into learning. She began organizing her ideas, her writing, her notes. Revisiting old feelings was exhausting, but also revealing. She wrote frankly, without trying to gloss over flaws, without disguising her mistakes. And when she finished the final chapter, she felt she had finally crossed the bridge she'd so feared crossing. Not because she'd overcome everything, but because she'd understood that guilt doesn't disappear, but can be transformed into awareness. A few weeks later, Laura and Daniel crossed paths again, this time at a contemporary art event. He was accompanied by Helena, she was alone. The encounter was brief but cordial. A nod, a respectful smile, and nothing more. But as she walked toward the exit, Laura took one last look at Daniel and thought, "He's happy. Really?" And as much as her heart ached, as much as the memory of the torn letter still echoed in some hidden corner of her mind, she knew it was right. She was no longer part of his journey. But now, perhaps, she was beginning to write her own with a truth she hadn't known before. Time had done what it always does to those who have the courage to face it, it reconfigured everything. And now, the story was moving toward its final outcome, where each choice made would exact its price, or reveal its reward. Because some decisions, once made, cannot be undone. And what is lost by not knowing how to love, almost never returns. Years passed, but some stories don't disappear, they simply settle in the back of our minds, silently, waiting for the right time to be understood. Daniel had moved forward in life with steadiness and serenity, maintaining a discreet yet admired presence in everything he did. He and Helena, after many walks, shared coffees, and silences that united them more than any words, decided to live together in a house far from the city center, surrounded by tall trees and wide windows that let the sun in without asking for permission. It was a home built not with urgency, but with intention. There was no rush between them, only a deep desire to care for each other. Every object inside had a new story, and none carried the shadow of the past. Over time, Helena began working as an illustrator from home, while Daniel continued with his creative projects and his lectures, now with a calm that only those who have weathered storms can cultivate. One late afternoon, upon returning from a small event, Daniel found Helena in the kitchen, laughing to herself as she tried to prepare a new recipe that was clearly going wrong. He approached, hugged her from behind, and remained silent for a few seconds. It was then that he understood, with definitive clarity, that he had won. Not in the sense of getting over his ex-wife, or erasing the pain of the past, but for having preserved his own essence even after everything he had experienced. He had not become bitter, he had not closed himself off to love, he had not lost himself in the search for justice or revenge. He simply kept going. He rebuilt. And in that moment, before the woman he had chosen for his present, he knew that true love is not the kind that never suffers, but the kind that, even after being destroyed, still believes in the possibility of blossoming. Laura had already taken a different path. Her book, chronicled in its narratives about regret, loss, and emotional reconstruction, caught the attention of many. She gained notoriety for her raw honesty, which led her to events, debates, and talk shows. She became a voice for people facing the consequences of their own choices, especially women who experienced the pain of regret after betrayal. But all this visibility brought with it something she hadn't expected, a public confrontation with her own mistake. At every book signing, with every incisive question from journalists, she was reminded of what she had done, what she had lost, and who she had hurt. She became a hostage to the past she tried to transform into a book, and however legitimate her intentions, it was as if her regret were eternally exposed, like an open scar for the whole world to see. During a live interview one afternoon, a reporter asked, with a coldness that mixed judgment and curiosity, if she would have acted differently if she could go back in time. Laura took a deep breath, swallowed the shame that still burned, and answered with brutal sincerity. She said she didn't know. Because back then, she was a woman who didn't know what she was dealing with. She said the worst part wasn't the guilt of having betrayed, but the knowledge that she had betrayed the only love who had ever loved her completely. The words left the studio silent, and for seconds, no one reacted. But there, for the first time, Laura felt she no longer needed to explain herself. She had already accepted her fall. That now, all she had to do was not fall again. Despite her late fame, Laura never again became deeply involved with anyone. She dated, flirted, even fell in love once, but her feelings were unrequited. And deep down, even when there was a chance for something new, her soul retreated. As if, unconsciously, she knew she would never again experience a love like the one she had with Daniel. This weight she would carry forever. Not as punishment, but as a natural consequence. In her apartment, she still kept the wooden box with the sealed envelope. She never had the courage to open it. It was the last reminder of what she wanted to keep, too late. Sometimes, she looked at that box as if visiting a grave. She knew that the woman she had been, the one she loved, betrayed, and lost, was buried there. And she also knew that nothing more would come from it. Daniel, however, eventually became a father. Helena became pregnant at a time they both didn't expect, but they welcomed the news with serene joy. The arrival of their son reorganized all their priorities, as life does when it decides there's always more to come. Daniel discovered in his role as a father a new way of loving, quieter, more protective, deeper. Watching his son grow, he felt healed in a way he hadn't known he needed. Not because he'd forgotten everything he'd experienced, but because, now, when telling bedtime stories, he realized he had something real to teach, the importance of caring, of keeping one's word, of knowing how to walk away when respect is no longer there, but also of forgiving when pain no longer serves as armor. Once, when the boy was already walking and babbling, Helena asked if he still thought about Laura. Daniel, with the frankness he always maintained with her, answered yes. He said it didn't hurt, that he didn't miss her, but that certain stories remain because they shape us. He said he didn't wish her harm, but that he hoped she had finally understood that love isn't what we feel, but what we do with what we feel. Helena embraced him, without jealousy, without insecurity, only with the certainty that she was with a whole man. And Daniel knew, once again, that he had won. Life wasn't cruel to Laura. But it was fair. It gave her room to grow, but it never gave her back what she had squandered. And that, in itself, was enough. On cold nights, sitting alone on the porch, she wrote new letters, which she didn't send, which she didn't show to anyone, just to keep the act of reflection alive. Daniel, in his new home, wrote letters too. But to his son. Letters that one day the boy would read, understanding that the father he once had was betrayed, yes, but he chose not to be defined by it. He chose to love again. And to love better. If you've made it this far, now I want to know, what did you think of this story? What part resonated with you the most? Comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel now, because we have many more powerful, real, and unforgettable stories like this one. And before we finish, take this thought with you: when betrayal happens, it doesn't just destroy the bond with the other person. It destroys trust, self-esteem, plans, and even the betrayed person's self-image. Cheating is breaking everything that was carefully built, leaving behind respect, admiration, and affection. And the cruelest thing is that, often, the betrayer only realizes this when it's too late. Here on the channel, we make it clear, we do not condone any kind of betrayal. Our commitment is to show, through fiction inspired by real life, how every choice has weight, consequences, and, above all, a price. Let this story serve as a reminder: those who destroy true love rarely find another like it. And when they do, they no longer deserve it.